Okay, hi Hot Corners, John Bleasdale here. I'm here today with Helen O'Hara, the author of Women versus Hollywood, The Fall and Rise of Women in Film. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak with me, Helen, and congratulations on a wonderful book.
Oh, thanks very much.
In a long tradition of me asking really stupid questions and occasionally getting really good answers from them, I'd like to ask.
Yes, my own journalistic technique. Yes, well done.
put everybody at their ease. It's really obvious, but kind of what inspired you to write this book? Was there an inciting incident, or is it just like, oh, this has been boiling for ages?
I mean, it is stuff that I've written about and talked about and thought about for a while, but it kind of came out specifically out of talking to my now editor, Amanda Keats, about something, that kind of felt like a gap, that felt like it hadn't been covered. And it kind of has. That's unfair. There are other books out there, but I wanted to sort of try and sum everything up and try and bring things together and look at the history of women in film, bringing it into sort of the issues that we have right now and trying to see where some of those came from. Because in the silent era, there were women making films, there were directors, there were screenwriters, 50% of screenwriters by some estimates, which is way more than there are now. So what happened and where did it go wrong and how can we sort of make it go right again? That was basically the question. And there were areas that I knew I'd want to cover. So I started doing a little bit of research, but it pretty much, I sort of had the vague outline of it from the beginning. So it's kind of half history and looking at, the silent era, the effects of censorship, which were actually massively racist because they stopped, say, Black women playing opposite, say, white men. Then you had just obviously the studio era, the contract, how those worked for women, the lack of female directors, what happened to them, where did they go, the effect of things like the auteur theory, because this sort of, made the director the sort of godlike figure, at least in film theory, and how does that affect, the chances of women getting to do that job. And I started with trying to figure out all of these things and make some kind of sense of them, at least to myself. I'm not saying they're definitive answers or anything else, but just try and look at how some of those shaped how we talk about films, how we think about films, and the chances that some people have to make films, because some people have more chances than others,
Absolutely. I mean, going back to the very beginning, that was I watch a lot of silent films and black and white pre-code films, but there are some revelations there in terms of like real heroes of cinema. In fact, I think that's it's brilliant that it's called The Fall and Rise of Women in Hollywood, because they were at a high point. What figures did you find which might serve as an inspiration from that period of cinema history?
Well, I mean, it's people like, so Alice Guy is potentially the first person to make a narrative feature, so not a sort of documentary. And that's obviously disputed. The exact dates are a little bit hazy, but she made certainly one of the first narrative films ever. It was about a fairy getting a baby from a cabbage patch. Very, very basic, about 30 seconds long, but kind of revolutionary. And she made, by some estimates, 1,000, excuse me, by some estimates 1,000, but certainly hundreds of films in the very early silent era. She was the sort of chief producer of films for Gaumont at one time. She moved to the US and set up her own studio and made more films there and was successful there again for another decade or so. And then you had somebody like Lois Weber, who actually acted under Alice Guy in the early days and then went and became a writer-director in her own right. And she too, enormously successful, was one of the most kind of sought after directors in town at one point, was the first mayor of Universal City when they declared themselves a sort of town, and was this kind of ambassador and kept making the case that women should make films, that women could make these morally uplifting, socially important films. And, she was a bit of a stick in the mud, I suspect, in some ways, but she was there and she was at the forefront of her art. She was paid an enormous sum of money because she was highly, highly valued and very successful. And then these women just were kind of written out of history. And I don't think it was necessarily a conscious effort to sort of hide them, but there was an effort to sort of treat the silent era as Hollywood's kind of awkward teenage years, and all of the women who worked in that era therefore were swept off to one side as well, you know. And they weren't allowed to make the leap to sound, and they weren't allowed to make the leap to studios, because by that point it felt like more of an industry, and I think they were wary of giving women too much power in that system.
Absolutely. I seem to remember there was a scene in Richard Attenborough's Chaplin where you see his contemporary. Is it Norma?
Mabel Normand.
Mabel Normand.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's kind of seen a little bit as someone who he has to get around and over in order to become Charlie Chaplin. But in your book, you sort of make the point, well, actually, she probably taught him a lot about directing.
Yeah, I mean, she'd made 100 or so films before he got to Hollywood, and, you know, co-directed some of his early stuff, worked with him. He has absolutely portrayed it as, oh, she was, you know, someone I had to get past. She was holding me back. But I mean, Max Sennett, whose studio they were both at, tells a slightly different story. For him, it was more, she took him under her wing. She kind of trained him in film techniques that then enabled him to become Charlie Chaplin. You know, she never got to write her own story because she died very young. And even by that point, nobody would have published it probably, because other people who wrote their own stories, other women, find no publishers, find no takers, and they were written out of history, you know. So yeah, it's about who got to tell their stories, and whose stories are remembered in the same way. And you know, look, this is not me doing work that's never been done before. There is a fantastic project called the Women Film Pioneers Project at Columbia University. They have this incredible database of hundreds of women in every imaginable profession who were doing this work in the early silent era. They just aren't necessarily in all the mainstream books, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, with Charlie Chaplin, there are a lot other sort of auteurs, and even the very idea of an author, there were very few male allies around actually helping their colleagues, or I mean, it seemed to be quite the opposite. And I think one of the things I found not necessarily surprising, but I mean, there's a lot about this book that it's that feeling that was similar to the Me Too movement, where you knew, but you didn't know that you knew. You know, you understood, but you didn't really acknowledge it. So, for instance, in the 60s and 70s, that revolutionary period, with a lot of my cinematic heroes, is actually a very regressive period for the portrayal of women as well.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was quite tough to write about, because like yourself, I love those guys. I love those films, and I admire them enormously. But the fact is, you know, Hollywood opened its doors to this new generation of directors, but they did not open those doors to women. And there were women who were there. There were women who had made independent films, who had gone to Cannes, who had done everything that you're supposed to do, and were just not given the opportunities. And they were knocking on the doors and they were trying, but they weren't, you know, let in. And I think that was partly because of this, you know, the auteur theory, the idea of what a director is, what a director should be, and how much we're willing to allow women to do that and to be that. So I think there was a real moment there that was, I think, lost, because Hollywood was experiencing this crisis of conscience and crisis of confidence at the end of the 60s. And that's why they opened the doors to these new guys. They thought these guys can maybe connect with the audience in a way that we can't. But once they had a few hits, it's almost like they stopped looking, and they thought, well, this is the new model. And that was it. And it really has been it for sort of 30 years. And we're only just getting past that and sort of beginning to think about, hey, maybe Patty Jenkins might bring something, maybe Kathy Yan, maybe Chloe Zhao might bring something to this, you know, because really we'd just been leaving it as it was.
I mean, that's what I found. My blood was boiling when I'm reading through your book, in a good way. But it's not, I mean, obviously the primary victim of this whole situation are the very talented women who are, you know, have their opportunities stymied, their careers ruined or shortened, and in some cases abused, as we'll get onto later. But it might seem a relatively minor thing, but the second thing is there's a whole lost era of counterfactual, a counterfactual Hollywood would include an Ida Lupino who had got as much freedom as a John Huston. What films we missed, you know?
Yeah.
Elaine May. I've just watched Mikey and Nikki. She's,
oh my God,
that's the best John Cassavetes film John Cassavetes couldn't make. You know, it's amazing.
But this is it. I mean, I think with this is the thing. I think because if you're the only woman in your field, or the only Black person, or the only whatever, there's so much pressure on you not to let the entire side down, and it does limit what you can do. And there have been some suggestions in some of the books that I read that Dorothy Arzner, for example, who was one of the very few women who survived the transition to sound, kind of held herself back and had to be careful about what she tried to do in a way that the men don't. And I've heard this from contemporary female directors as well. You know, they want to go in and they say, look, I have to go in super prepared, knowing every angle that I want, every moment that I want to hit. Because if I go in and I say, oh, I don't know, let's try this. No, that's not right. Let's try this. They think I'm a ditz. Whereas a man might be allowed to say, you know what? Okay, we're experimenting. We're being creative. You know, let's play it fast and loose. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah.
And women don't necessarily have that, creative freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. Kubrick, you know, there was a book about Tom Cruise recently that, you know, the famous thing that Kubrick does hundreds of takes is basically because he's working it out. He hasn't got a clue what he's doing. Well, hasn't got a clue what he's doing, might be exaggerating, but
and that was Elaine May thing. Oh, sorry, that was Elaine May's thing, that she wanted to work it out and wanted to do multiple takes and figure out things as she went, and the studio hated her for it. Hated it.
Yeah, it's such a shame because A New Leaf as well, another Elaine May film.
Oh, I know.
Amazing. And she made very few films, you know, as you say, because of studio interference. Coming up to sort of more recently, and obviously the Me Too movement and Enough is Enough, in terms of pay equality. I mean, I don't really necessarily want to conflate those two things because they're extremely, you know, they've got different sort of spheres and different legal repercussions and moral things as well. I mean, how do you feel that's going at the moment? Do you think that's something that is sort of petering out, or do you think that's something which is building and we're making genuine progress?
I think we'll make genuine progress as long as we keep talking about it, basically, is the boring answer, because I think there is, as you say, sort of a real danger of it petering out. We've seen this before in Hollywood many, many times when people have pushed for change and then stopped pushing because they thought, oh, well, you know, that's taken care of now, and it never is. So I think, you know, let's say with pay equity and female director opportunities and female opportunities of all sorts, those will continue to be an issue for Hollywood as long as people keep calling them out on Twitter and keep, you know, asking for these things and keep making a fuss about these things. Me Too is a tougher one. I think the issue there was basically a complete lack of consequences, realistically, for abusers. And that's been true since the beginning of Hollywood. The chances of getting caught were virtually zero, and they remain virtually zero. This is not a Hollywood problem. You know, they reckon in the US that 5 out of 1,000 rape cases result in a conviction. So there is no practical expectation of being caught. And the richer you are, the more powerful you are, the lower those chances are. That's the issue with someone like Harvey Weinstein. And the problem with the way that Hollywood's set up is that there are an enormous number of people who are trying for a very, very small number of places, you know, whether it's directing jobs, acting jobs, doesn't matter, but there's a very, very limited number of them, a huge number of people who'd love to do it, and a tiny number of mostly men with the power to make decisions on a whim. And there's no sort of systemic way of assessing who gets the job. It's all very impressionistic. And so there is a sort of, maybe incentive is the wrong word, I don't know, but there is this room in the system for exploitation to occur, because there is room for a producer, say, to claim that he can make or break your career in a word, in a moment. And it is true. That's the killer. He really can, because it is all a very small town. Word gets around. you know, one person liking you can make the difference between life or death in your career. And I think all of us have this. This is not, again, this is not just Hollywood. I know that many of the opportunities I've had in my career have been because somebody happened to like me. And I think that is true of a lot of us, if we're honest. And so if you're in a position where somebody holds your future in their hands and then asks something inappropriate in return for that future, you know, it's going to put you in a very, very difficult position, especially in Hollywood, where the riches are so rich and the lows are so low.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to I don't want to sort of leave the impression that this is in any way like a very dark book, because although it's rightfully has a rightful fury about it, it's also a great read. It's also and it's obviously infused with a love of movies. How do you sort of how do you balance that sometimes when you know that maybe the people who have gone and the processes that have gone towards making a movie that you love are not people that you would necessarily like to spend any time with in real life?
Yeah, it's the difference between the artist and the art, isn't it? And it is really tough. And there are some films, you know, in recent years that I have struggled to go back and watch, you know, with that in mind. You know, certain stars, let's say, who have been disgraced, and I don't want to watch his work or whatever. At the same time, you know, I love Shakespeare in Love, for example. I think it's a really fun, light film. And even if Harvey Weinstein was involved in the Oscar campaign for it, like, I still love the film and I don't want to hold everybody responsible for him. So it's really difficult, actually. And it is something that I don't have a clear answer to, because there's some things I'm totally happy to watch again, despite knowing, you know, let's say, I don't know, Clark Gable was a terrible person. He killed a person in a hit and run accident. He date raped Loretta Young, like, terrible person, still great on screen, you know. So, but I probably watch less of him than I watch of Cary Grant, for example, or less of him than I watch of Jimmy Stewart, you know. So it is difficult. But I do still love film. And I think that every film is such a collaborative effort that even if there's, you know, to use a cliche, a bad apple in the bunch, so many good people still worked on it, that's kind of how I square it with myself, I suppose. But yeah, I think there's room for anger at the things that have been done to people, and at the opportunities that have been missed, and at the, you know, the decisions that ruined lives, quite frankly, throughout this. But at the same time, there are also moments of greatness and films that have changed the world for the better, and films that have given us escape and release and refuge, especially during tough times like the past year or two, that, you know, are worth celebrating. And you know, it's one of these things where when we criticize films, we're acting from a place of love. We want films to be great. And I think that's honestly what, you know, myself and most film critics feel. We always go in wanting it to be great. And it's kind of a little bit the same with writing a book about Hollywood. You want it to be great. It just, you have to acknowledge sometimes it isn't quite.
I guess like it's like anyone you love, you have to you know, accept their negative parts as well, or not even accept necessarily, but at least recognize.
Yeah, exactly.
And in terms of the again, in terms of the present day and going into the future, you name checked a few directors like Chloe Zhao and Patty Jenkins. Do you feel more hopeful? I mean, I'm sometimes I'm going to festivals and I'm looking, and there seems to be a lot, even beyond Hollywood, more broadly. There seems to be a larger body of female directed and female driven, written, produced work getting out there. I mean, I don't know if maybe that's just the festivals I go to, but is that your impression as well, or how do you see it?
No, yeah, that is my impression. I think that, but again, this is part of this effort to make noise about it. This is part of the effort to talk about it, probably incessantly, but it is making people reckon with this, and it's making, you know, festivals think more about what they can do. And so you're seeing in a lot of the festivals I talked to for the book, you're seeing efforts to have a gender balanced selection team and programming team, and they're talking now and looking at, you know, female made films and whether they have, you know, enough of them, frankly, in their festival, whether they're treating them fairly. Because yes, there's absolutely a problem of there being fewer female made films. I don't think many festivals so far have gotten to 50-50 unless they are specifically focused on women's films. So there are still fewer of them being made. But if you have a balanced selection committee, you can hopefully spot your own biases a little bit and deal with those unconscious biases and think about, well, am I acting like this war movie is more important and worthy of our time than this, you know, I don't know, domestic drama, because I'm conditioned to think that male subjects are more important than female subjects. And again, that's drawing with a very broad brush, but you know what I mean.
No,
we have had this tendency to consider movies about men to be more weighty and important than movies about women. And I think what festivals are beginning to do is to try and challenge that notion a little bit, think a bit harder about that, and try and judge things a little bit more clearly on their merits.
yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the demeaning of a sort of genre as sort of like, I don't know, rom-com or something. And so we're not going to even bother engaging with it. And I recently sat down and watched Clueless for the first time and was just blown away. It's just like one of the best films I've ever seen. And I don't mean that in any sort of asterisk, ironically, or anything like that. It just is one of the best films I've ever seen. You know, it's practically perfect. And why?
Oh, it's delightful.
Yeah, and why didn't I feel like I had to watch that movie the way I feel that I have to watch, you know, a Kurosawa film or an Orson Welles movie? You know, it deserves to be on that canon.
Yeah, I honestly, I kind of agree, but I think that's getting back into the idea that I tried to look at as well in the book about gatekeepers, about who gets to decide what's important, and it is critics and it's festivals and it's awards, and as long as all of those are dominated by mostly white, mostly middle class men, mostly straight, then you're also going to get those kind of subjects that come up again and again. So yes, you know, they will absolutely, you know, consider foreign films, and that's a separate category, but they won't necessarily consider female made films as important. They won't necessarily consider films made by people of color in their own country as important. There is a tendency for the canon itself to be, you know, heavy, let's say, on straight white men, and then that you know, that's the standard by which we judge all films, and so that's the norm, that's the default setting almost, and that's the problem, and that's what we have to change. And I think as we widen that and we start genuinely talking seriously about, you know, Clueless for one, but Leave No Trace, for example, you know, that Deborah Granick film, incredible film. Why aren't we talking about that more? Why aren't we talking more about, I don't know, Monster? Why aren't we talking more about Point Break? You know, and I feel like if you start kind of rebalancing what the canon is and what the canon looks like and who gets to decide what the canon is, then we start getting into a situation where we are opening up a bit more. But, you know, this is not about hating men. This is not about blaming men. This is not about not liking films with men in. It's more just about widening the doors a little bit, because I think men especially are taught specifically by our society not to like anything associated with girls, and are taught that it's somehow dangerous or undermines their masculinity or something to get too into girly stuff. And it's a shame for men too. You know, I feel like it would be good, because I feel like I get something from male-led films and I enjoy them, and I enjoy putting myself in somebody else's shoes for a bit. And, you know, men should have the same opportunity without friends calling them names.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's terrible that we're going to finish on how terrible things are for men. it's come round.
No, but I mean, I genuinely do believe that. I genuinely think that, you know, inequality hurts everybody, and that's so yeah. So just to say, I don't hate men. want to be clear. Some of my best friends are men. You know, it's great.
Oh, that's brilliant. Listen, Helen, I wish we could speak. We could easily speak for an hour, but thank you so much for agreeing to speak to me. And I'll put a link up for the book. It's called Women versus Hollywood: The Rise. The Fall and Rise.
Fall and Rise.
The Rise and Fall and Fall and Rise. The Fall and Rise of Women in Film. Thank you once more, Helen.
Pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.